I'm Colin Sanders, and this is the History Books Review. And the book I'm reviewing this time is Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. It's unusual to find a history book which has a truly novel take on a historical story, and even rarer to find one that's got quite a simple one. The premise behind Paul Kennedy's book is really straightforward and sort of obvious. The rise and fall of great powers is basically down to how powerful they are, which is a combination of the resources available to them and how efficiently they use those resources. You would have thought it's been done before, but apparently not, because this is a unique book. It starts in 1500 and reviews the world in 1500, at which point in time it would not have been at all obvious that Europe was going to become the seat of most of the major powers of the world. Ming China looked a lot more promising as a candidate for great power status. The Ming Empire had 150 million inhabitants compared to Europe's 50 million. It was politically united and it had a higher level of technological sophistication, so any outside observer would clearly put their money on the Mings rather than the Europeans. But interestingly, many of the Europeans' disadvantages turned out to be advantages in disguise. For example, the horrible weather of Northern Europe made sea travel rather perilous. So the Northern Europeans, the Dutch, the English, the Danes, developed very robust and reliable boats, which in time would become ocean-going So the British, the Danes and the Dutch produced boats that were robust and reliable and would in time become ocean-going. The political disunity of Europe in comparison with the Ming Empire was particularly notable, and the closest the Europe produced to a version of the Mings was the Habsburgs, who singularly failed to unite Europe under a single hegemonic power. They were really quite rubbish at it, despite having huge resources at their disposal. This meant that the Europeans spent a lot of their time worrying about their security and plotting to violate the security of their neighbours, which in turn led to advances in weapons technology and military organisation, which ultimately proved to be highly useful to them. In the long run, it turned out that organisational ability was nearly as important as the technology and the resources. A good example being the French finance minister Colbert, who managed to organise France's economy so efficiently that Louis XIV was able to fight wars throughout most of his reign without absolutely bankrupting the country. Though he did come quite close to it, France would probably have done rather better had Louis spent less time fighting and more time just building up his economy. This was a factor which wasn't so much of a problem later on. Come the American Civil War and the Wars of German Unification, wars became short, sharp and very resource demanding, which forced efficiencies onto them. So both Germany and America emerged from periods of internal conflict, which at the time were very, very, very severe and very violent, without actually doing too much long-term damage to their economy. So both Germany and America set themselves up for superpower status by the requirements of heavy fighting. So it's somewhat paradoxical, but quite interesting. The ultimate in improving resource allocation efficiency was, of course, industrialisation. And industrialisation allowed countries with quite small resource bases to project power on a really surprisingly large scale. The classic example was Great Britain, which is a fairly small island off the coast of Europe, but by industrialising first, early and effectively, managed to get into the realms of the great powers more or less by dint of this industrial process more than anything else. Another very comparable example is Japan, which followed pretty much the same route as Britain, in fact probably consciously emulated it in some ways. Another power that followed the route of industrialisation leading to great power was Germany. Though interestingly, Germany's neighbour, Russia, was following quite closely on its heels, and in fact in the long run the larger resources of Russia would prove decisive in turning Russia into a more powerful state than Germany. There's a very interesting graph that Paul Kennedy produces where he looks at the economic power of Russia and directly compares it to the economic power of Germany and calculates the ratio. If you look at that graph, you see that the low point from the Russian point of view was about 1905, but after that, although both Germany and Russia were both growing in power and developing their strength, Russia was developing more quickly, and basically with every year that went past, the relative strength of the two countries altered. When you bear this in mind, it becomes perhaps a little more easy to understand why Germany had two major wars with Germany over this period of time. It makes Hitler's decision to invade Russia when he did, as early as he basically could manage it, seem a lot more sensible than it's normally portrayed in histories and accounts of the time. The interesting country that towards the end of the book is the one which we started off with. Ming China, of course, failed to capitalise on its advantages and fell into very much a backwater in terms of world powers. But by the 1980s, when Paul Kennedy wrote this book, it was beginning to recover and gain strength and influence. At the time he was writing it, the Chinese economy was still smaller than that of Britain. However, he predicted confidently that the power of China would rise and rise steadily. And interestingly, there's a graph where he shows China rapidly rising and becoming much stronger than several other comparable powers, which of course has happened. He doesn't come up with a graph of Chinese power relative to that of the United States. That would be quite interesting to see, wouldn't it? Luckily, there doesn't appear at the moment to be any serious risk of major power struggles between China and America. So maybe the Germany and Russia case was just one of those things, and the rise of great powers doesn't necessarily involve huge scale conflict like it always has done over the last 500 years. Let's hope so. In the meantime, thanks for listening.